Take a deep breath and listen. By the end of this reflection, you may begin to see that your exhaustion is not a lack of faith. It is a sacred doorway calling you back to a living trust. For so long, you have walked through the quiet, shadowed rooms of your life feeling as though you are constantly pouring out water into empty vessels. You are someone who feels everything deeply. Your sensitive heart registers every shift in the wind, every unspoken pain in the room, and every heavy sigh of those around you. You have carried this deep empathy not just as a part of who you are, but as a heavy burden placed upon your shoulders by a world that constantly demands your energy. You might have spent years believing that your deep sensitivity was a flaw, a weakness that made you vulnerable to the heavy demands of others. But what if your fragile, feeling heart is exactly how the divine light enters the world, making you a target only because your compassion threatens their need for control? Chosen one, you are not failing because you are tired. You are tired because you have been carrying the expectations of a religious system that feeds on your light, asking you to burn yourself out to keep others warm. It is a profound exhaustion, a weariness that settles into the very bones of your spirit, leaving you wondering why your kindness always seems to lead to your own depletion. You have been told to give endlessly, to forgive blindly, and to silence your own needs in the name of spiritual devotion. You have existed in spaces where your goodness and your deep capacity to understand others were not honored as sacred gifts, but were instead manipulated and used as tools for someone else's religious performance. You became the emotional anchor for people who refused to do their own spiritual work, the quiet listener for those who only wanted an audience. They framed this exploitation as a spiritual duty, telling you that true faith requires you to completely erase your own boundaries. You were taught to see your exhaustion as a sign of your holiness, when in reality, it was the symptom of spiritual manipulation. Wounded believer, you have been trying to satisfy the demands of environments that are fundamentally toxic, places where vulnerability is treated as a weakness to be exploited, rather than a sacred space to be protected. You have been gaslit into believing that your inability to keep up with their endless demands is a sign of your own spiritual inadequacy. But your exhaustion is not a failure of faith. It is your soul's desperate attempt to warn you that you are surviving in an environment that is slowly draining your divine essence. They handed you an image of God that perfectly mirrored their own need for control. They taught you to fear a distant, supernatural judge, a deity sitting on a high throne, watching your every move like a cosmic scorekeeper. Marcus Borg's work points us toward the realization that this supernatural, distant judge is often a human invention, constructed to enforce rigid compliance rather than invite genuine transformation. You were taught to believe that this God was constantly evaluating your performance, waiting for you to fail, and demanding that you earn every ounce of grace through your endless suffering and people-pleasing. This image of God was terrifying, a heavy shadow that hung over your every decision and silenced your every doubt. They handed you an image of a god who acts like a cosmic scorekeeper, constantly measuring your worth by how well you perform their religious duties. But this distant judge was never the divine voice. It was simply the megaphone they used to keep your beautiful spirit trapped in endless anxiety. It was an image designed to keep you afraid, to keep you striving, and to keep you bound to their system of approval. Those who manipulated you, the religious voices that demanded your submission, used this terrifying image of God to maintain their own purity systems. They created strict lines of who was acceptable and who was broken, who was faithful and who was rebellious. They used the fear of divine punishment to force you into compliance, wrapping their own desire for dominance in the language of holiness. They told you that if you set boundaries, you were being selfish. They told you that if you walked away from their toxic dynamics, you were walking away from God. They weaponized the sacred to maintain their own power, using your beautiful, sensitive spirit as the foundation for their religious empires. You were told that your questions were dangerous, that your intuition was deceptive, and that you must rely entirely on their interpretations of the divine will. This is how the system of religious manipulation operates. It isolates you from your own inner knowing and forces you to depend on the very people who are draining your life force. This relentless manipulation has planted a deep, painful seed of doubt within your own mind. It has bred a spiritual imposter syndrome, a constant whispering fear that you are somehow faking your faith, that you are not good enough, and that you are always one mistake away from being entirely abandoned by the divine. You have hidden your true self, your honest doubts, and your deep spiritual intuition because you were afraid of being exposed and rejected by the community you tried so hard to serve. You have silenced your own inner light, dimming your brilliance to make others feel more comfortable. But, beloved child of God, you must begin to see that this imposter syndrome is not the voice of the Spirit. It is the lingering echo of their manipulation, the residual fear left behind by a system that needed you to feel small so they could feel powerful. The exhaustion you feel is the heavy toll of performing a version of yourself that was never meant to exist. The divine light within you has not been extinguished. It has only been waiting for you to recognize that you no longer have to perform for a God who has always loved you exactly as you are. The journey to freedom often begins in the quietest, most desolate places. When you finally step away from the noise of religious manipulation, you might find yourself standing in what feels like a vast, empty wilderness. This isolation can be terrifying, feeling less like freedom and more like a profound abandonment. But let us look at the ancient stories, the sacred narratives that tell the truth about the human soul. Consider Elijah, as told in the 19th chapter of 1 Kings. Elijah was exhausted, running for his life from those who sought to destroy him, fleeing the intense, manipulative powers of his day. He collapsed under a solitary broom tree in the wilderness, asking simply to be let go, completely drained by the demands of his prophetic calling. He sought God in the dramatic, performative displays of power. The great wind, the earth-shattering quake, the consuming fire. But the divine presence was not in the chaos or the loud, threatening noise. The sacred met Elijah in the sound of sheer silence. You were told that God only speaks in the loud, performative fires of religious certainty. But what if the sacred is the quiet, encompassing breath holding you right now, wrapping around your exhausted shoulders in the sheer silence of the wilderness? Marcus Borg taught the principle that God is not a being out there, separate and distant, but rather the encompassing spirit, the sacred presence in whom we live, move, and have our being. This panentheistic vision means that the divine is right here, nearer to you than your own breath, holding you in a love that requires no performance. You do not have to travel to a specific altar, shout a specific prayer, or meet the demands of a religious leader to access the sacred. The wilderness you find yourself in is not a place of punishment. It is a thin place, a sacred threshold where the artificial walls of religious manipulation finally fall away, allowing you to experience the divine presence without interference. In this quiet place, you are safe from their judgments. Here, the encompassing spirit gently holds your exhaustion, validating your need for rest and silence. But quiet your heart, beloved one. You must gently examine the stirrings of your spirit. Do not confuse the quiet, sober clarity of spiritual discernment with the reactive anger of your past religious trauma. True discernment brings peace and invites you to pray for those who manipulated you, even as you firmly set healthy boundaries to protect your soul. The lingering wounds of manipulation will try to convince you to build walls of bitterness, to lash out, or to isolate yourself in permanent anger. But the encompassing spirit invites you into a different way. You can recognize the toxicity of the systems that hurt you without letting their poison dictate your future. You can walk away from the table where you were starved, not to burn the table down, but to finally sit in the peaceful meadow of God's grace and learn how to be nourished again. As you sit in this quiet space, you must also confront the way the sacred texts were used against you. For so long, you felt crushed by scriptures used as weapons, thrown at you to demand your absolute submission to their rules. You were handed a Bible that functioned as a rulebook of manipulation, a collection of verses weaponized to induce guilt, enforce compliance, and silence your intuition. But let us re-see the ancient journey. Look at the path of the Israelites described in Exodus chapter 13, verses 17 and 18. When they were finally freed from the crushing slavery of Egypt, God did not lead them on the shortest, most direct route to their destination. The direct route would have led them straight into war, into a battle they were too fragile and exhausted to fight. Instead, the divine presence led them on a long detour through the wilderness. This detour was not a punishment for a lack of faith. It was an act of profound, protective pacing. It was the divine acknowledging their trauma and giving them the space they needed to heal before they faced the future. In Borg's framework, the Bible is a sacrament of the sacred, a window through which the light of the divine shines, to be taken seriously, but not literally. What if these ancient texts were never meant to be chains of manipulation, but open windows inviting you to catch a glimpse of a compassion that has never rejected you. When you begin to read the scriptures not as a rigid manual of behavior, but as a metaphorical journey of a people wrestling with the divine, the words lose their power to condemn you. The Bible becomes a vast, ancient tapestry of human experience, filled with stories of people who doubted, who ran away, who failed, and who were still relentlessly loved by the encompassing Spirit. You are no longer required to intellectually agree with every literal interpretation forced upon you by those who sought to control you. You are invited, instead, to look through the metaphorical window and see the divine light that shines warmly upon your own complicated, beautiful, and healing life. And as you look through that window, you begin to see Jesus in an entirely new light. Borg's reading of Jesus helps us see him not as a rigid enforcer of divine law, but as a Jewish spirit mystic whose core message shattered the purity systems of his day, replacing them with radical compassion. Jesus walked directly into the meticulously constructed boundaries of religious performance, the very boundaries that labeled people as clean or unclean, righteous or sinful, acceptable or rejected, and he dismantled them completely. He touched the untouchable, ate with the marginalized, and fiercely challenged the religious elites who used the name of God to manipulate and exclude. Jesus did not come to build a higher wall of religious performance or to give power to those who drain your energy. He came to dissolve those walls entirely, inviting you to step away from the crowd that judges you and walk into a space of radical, unconditional belonging. Consider the profound restoration found in the 42nd chapter of Job. Job sat on an ash heap, stripped of everything, covered in wounds, and in his deepest pain, he was surrounded by friends who used their rigid theology to manipulate him. They insisted that his suffering must be the result of his own hidden sins, demanding that he confess and conform to their neat, predictable formulas of how God operates. They tried to gaslight Job into abandoning his own inner knowing, but Job refused to perform for their theological approval. He argued with the divine, he expressed his raw, unfiltered anger, and ultimately, he encountered a God of unfathomable mystery and presence. It was Job, the one who questioned and resisted the religious manipulation of his friends, who was ultimately vindicated by the sacred. Child of God, you, like Job, are allowed to reject the simplistic, manipulative formulas of those who claim to speak for the divine. Chosen one, you are allowed to trust your own experience of the sacred mystery, knowing that the encompassing Spirit meets you not in the perfection of your performance, but in the honest, raw reality of your actual life. When you finally walk away from the religious structures that manipulated your sensitive heart, a strange and terrifying feeling often follows. They convinced you that stepping away from their control meant you were losing your faith. Because they equated faith with absolute agreement to their rules, your departure feels, at first, like a catastrophic spiritual failure. But Marcus Borg once wrote that faith is not about intellectual certainty or holding on to rigid dogmas with white knuckles. Faith is fiducia, a deep letting go, like floating on the deep sea of God's goodness. Faith is not blindly agreeing with those who manipulate your kindness. It is the quiet courage to let go of their expectations and trust that the vast sea of God's grace is strong enough to hold your weight. What you are experiencing right now is not the loss of your faith, but the shedding of your religious conditioning. You are losing the fear, the anxiety, and the exhausting need to perform. And in the empty space left behind by those heavy burdens, true faith is finally finding room to breathe. This transition is the ultimate turning of the tables. The manipulators who once fed on your energy relied entirely on your fear of being cast out. They maintained their power by making you believe that you could not survive spiritually without their approval. But as you learn to float on the deep sea of divine goodness, as you realize that the encompassing Spirit is holding you directly, their power over you completely evaporates. You begin to understand that you do not need an intermediary to experience the sacred. You do not need a toxic community to validate your worth. The imposter syndrome that plagued you begins to fade, replaced by a quiet, steady inner knowing. You realize that your sensitivity, your deep empathy, and your intuitive understanding of the pain of others were never flaws to be exploited. They are the very qualities that equip you to be a beacon of healing in a fractured world. You are transforming from a victim of manipulation into a leader guided by gentle, hard-won wisdom. Your sensitive heart, once viewed as a liability, becomes your greatest strength. Because you know what it feels like to be judged, you know how to offer radical acceptance. Because you know the deep exhaustion of religious performance, you know how to create spaces where people are allowed to simply rest. You lead not by demanding compliance, but by offering compassion. You lead not by projecting certainty, but by embracing mystery and walking alongside others in their doubts. This is the path of the spirit mystic, the way of Jesus, a path that does not seek to conquer or control, but to heal and to liberate. You are stepping into a profound spiritual maturity, one that no longer fears the judgments of those who remain trapped in their rigid systems. You are safe now. You have walked through the fire of isolation and emerged not burned but purified. The expectations that once crushed you have been lifted. You no longer have to contort your spirit into unnatural shapes to fit into boxes that were always too small for the vastness of your soul. You are a child of the encompassing Spirit, held in an unconditional love that predates your first breath and will outlast your final heartbeat. You do not have to earn this love. You do not have to perform for it. You simply have to rest in it. The deep, heavy exhaustion that has plagued you for so long can finally begin to dissipate as you realize that the sacred presence requires absolutely nothing from you except your willingness to be loved. Chosen one. You were called not to suffer under their weight, but to awaken to your own divine light. Your journey through manipulation and exhaustion was not a punishment, but the painful breaking of the shell that kept your true self contained. Now, you stand in the open air, free to breathe, free to trust, and free to live with a sensitive heart that is protected by the fierce, gentle grace of the divine. As we close our time together, I want you to listen to the quiet space within your own chest. What is the heavy burden of expectation you are being invited to lay down today? What is the false image of God or the lingering voice of a manipulator that you are finally ready to release into the wind? If you feel a quiet peace rising in your heart, if you feel the gentle buoyancy of a love that is finally holding your weight, I invite you to write, "I am learning to trust again," in the comments below. May you walk in peace, knowing you belong entirely to the sacred, and may your beautiful, sensitive heart forever be a sanctuary of light.